The notion of numerical identity comes up twice in this course. Once when we were thinking about sense and reference, and here again in the context of thinking about personal identity. We want to get a clear focus on the notion because any confusion here is going to throw us off completely in thinking about personal identity. Now, Olson gives us a warning. I think this is true. He says, few concepts have been the source of more misunderstanding than identity over time. The persistence question, that's our question about personal identity, is often confused with other questions or stated in a tendentious way. That's true. Now, you want to avoid doing that in order to focus on the issue that matters. So you know that our theme is what's necessary for your personal survival, and you know that we're formulating that in the way that Olson does. We're saying that if a person exists at one time and a thing exists at another time, under what possible circumstances is it the case that the thing is the person? Great, good question. Now let's be really careful here. So first of all, we're going to distinguish between qualitative similarity and numerical identity. So I drive onto campus in the olden days. I drive onto campus in my shiny new car. I'm very proud of my car. It's a red car. It's made by Toyota and it's a Toyota, right? And you drive onto the campus in your shiny new car and you're very pleased with your shiny new car and you say, Steve, that is the exact same car as mine. You and I, our cars are identical. And that's true. We bought them. They were made completely to the same specification, right? Or you might look at my shirt and you might say, Steve, my dad has got that shirt. His shirt is identical to yours. But you don't, of course, mean that your dad's shirt and my shirt are one and the same, right? That they're numerically identical. Just as our cars aren't numerically identical, you drive yours, I drive mine, I wear my shirt, you wear yours. What you mean is that they have a lot of properties in common. They're qualitatively similar. They may even be qualitatively indistinguishable. That's to say, there's no property at all that they have that allows us to distinguish one from another. If we swapped shirts without knowing it, we wouldn't know. We'd never be able to solve that. Qualitatively indistinguishable, yes. Numerically identical, no. How do we know? Because there are two. There are two. I don't know if you can see my fingers here. I'm doing this with my fingers. Here you go. There are two. Sure, I'm going to learn to do lectures soon. So that's one distinction, right? Qualitative similarity doesn't amount to numerical identity. They're distinct notions. What we're concerned with in thinking about personal identity is numerical identity, I think. Another key distinction is between having an identity and numerical identity. So when people talk loosely about identity, they often mean something which is quite different from, and doesn't involve the notion of numerical identity at all. Let's illustrate that. So here's the comedian Sacha Baron Cohen.
Why is the actual heartbeat so old-fashioned? You know, boom, 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 boom. That's a bit.
Now he's a comic genius, Sacha Baron Cohen, and he has, of course, a number of identities, as we might put it. Right here he is as Ali G. Elsewhere you can see him as Borat, and so on. I was going to show you Eddie Izzard, who's another of my favourites, and then I realised that Eddie Izzard doesn't have a number of identities. Eddie Izzard just seems to be himself, right, which is lovely and wonderful. So here we have someone where you might say, look, there are multiple identities involved, but this isn't an issue about numerical identity. Here we're using the term identity in a very loose way to mean something like, you know, multiple persona or multiple fictional persons, multiple characters, right? He can play multiple characters. And there are, of course, people who live their lives as multiple different characters. So you might say multiple people. But of course, the point of this is that there is really one person, right? That's why it's dramatic and interesting. There's one person, might be surprising, who is both Ali G and Borat and Sacha Baron Cohen. And you could be really quite surprised to discover that. So the issue that we're interested in personal identity is the issue about numerical identity, the unity that underpins all of those different persona, or what you might loosely speaking call identities. Here's one more example of this. So famously, I believe this is true, famously, Superman and Clark Kent are one and the same, but to many people it seems like there are quite different things involved there, right? Superman is something quite different from Clark Kent, this sort of rather mild office worker. So if you like, we've got two different personalities, but one person. You might be tempted to say, well, there are two identities there, right? He identifies as Superman and as Clark Kent separately. But that's not an issue for us about personal identity. We're not interested in that at all. So our focus is on the notion of personal identity. And in thinking about personal identity, I'm saying we're thinking about numerical identity. But just here we run into a problem. The problem is very simple. David Lewis says, he's a famous metaphysician, I'm sure you're going to come across him again. David Lewis says, identity is utterly simple and unproblematic. Everything is identical to itself. Nothing is ever identical to anything except itself. There is never any problem about what makes something identical to itself. Nothing can ever fail to be. And there is never any problem about what makes two things identical. Two things can never be identical. So just here I think we face an awkward dilemma. I want to understand the question about personal identity. So I have to understand the is when we ask, under what circumstances is it the case that the person is the thing? I've got to understand it is there. Now I know that this isn't a matter of two things being qualitatively similar, and I know that it can't be a matter of there being kind of different persona or different characters that the thing is playing, right? So when is Ali G Borat? Never, right? As far as the characters go, those are two separate characters. So I think those are separate issues. So I want to understand this in terms of numerical identity. But what Lewis says seems to me right. Identity is utterly simple and unproblematic. There just can't be questions about when two things are identical, under what circumstances they're identical. After all, if they are two, then they're not identical, right? And if it's just one thing, well, it can never fail to be identical to itself, so there's no issue there as well. So now I face a dilemma. I'm not completely convinced I understand this question about personal identity. I think Olson's formulation is good. We should hold on to it. I'm not suggesting we reject it, but I am suggesting there's something that we don't fully understand here. It seems like it must be a question about numerical identity. But if it's a question about numerical identity, it kind of has to be a trivial question. Ouch.